All right, good morning, everyone. This is Ian Henderson from WCASA. Welcome to our part 3 of our medical series of webinars. Today we are pleased to have Lori Thompson from DOJ, and I'll introduce her in 1 second. The first 2 topics that were in our medical webinar series were information on compassionate care for rape victims, and we had Mike Murray from the Alliance for Women's Health presenting, and then part 2 was presenters from the crime lab talking about the composition of the forensic kits and testing forensic evidence. So you should know that those are archived on our website. And so if you have not attended either of those and are interested, please see our website for those webinars. This series of webinars came about from questions we had received from advocates over the course of the year, and so we thought it would be a good opportunity just to package a nice series of webinars related to medical topics. So today we are, as I mentioned, fortunate to have Lori from DOJ, who is going to be presenting on sexual assault nurse examiners and the work that she does at DOJ. So without further ado, one last thing, if you have questions as Lori's going through her presentation, certainly feel free to type them in through the chat, and we will pass those along as they come in. So feel free to send those along as they come up. And now I will hand it over to Lori. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. So basically what I'm going to do is just go through, like Ian said, a little bit of my role, and then also there seems to be a lot of questions throughout the state regarding the DOJ SANE work that we've been doing. So I'm going to go ahead and I've been in this role since May of 2015, and it was a really good program that was already put together, and really I've just been tweaking it with course evaluation comments, and then also best practice recommendations from the International Association of Forensic Nurses, which is kind of our Bible when it comes to the trainings. So I just want to give this disclaimer out front that there have been a lot of questions regarding, the IFM suggests this and does this, but the DOJ is saying we have to do that. And we had made a commitment at the DOJ to make sure that best practices were followed throughout the state, because it's the victims that we have that are our priorities. So we want to make sure we have the best outcomes possible, and in doing so, we think that we can attain that through best practices. So law enforcement, Miriam does law enforcement trainings, Audrey does trainings, and so my piece of this is the nursing part of this. So when the IFN makes educational recommendations, and their guidelines were last updated in last year, we have adapted the classes to follow those best practice recommendations. So if it's a recommendation through the IFN that is based on their current research and best practice recommendations, they become DOJ SANE requirements. So that being said, our course requirements, specifically for SANE and SANE nursing, it is required that the attendees be at least a registered nurse, physician's assistant, or an advanced practice nurse, including ClinSpecs and nurse practitioners without restrictions, meaning their licenses are not in jeopardy, they're not being suspended. They have at least a minimum of 2 years practice under their belt, meaning they have been practicing in that role as a registered nurse for at least 2 years minimum. A lot of times I've gotten questions from nurses and even people who weren't nurses that just want to have the information. They may not be using it. They may not ever practice as a SANE, but they want to just have that information just in case. So I talked to the SANE faculty and my administration at DOJ, and we decided that it was really important to have a facility where they would be actually performing SANE exams prior to taking the class. And a lot of this comes from the faculty simply because faculty, before they send an interested nurse to the SANE program or the SANE class, that they want to expose them to the work. It's not so much about collecting the evidence. There's a lot of emotional fortitude that one has to have in order to do this work, and I think it allows the program coordinators to assess that about nurses that potentially they would be sending to our classes, and it also helps with SANE sustainability in the future. And then our course, our SANE course, is very full, very on the agenda, and so it is a completion. We have to complete that course before they enroll in the SANE P, because the baseline knowledge in the SANE A is built upon in the SANE P. The only thing that we do that's redundant in the SANE P from the SANE A is the mock trial. The information is all different. Any questions? Okay. So we have one more class for this series in the fall, 2017. It's the pediatric class, which is going to be held the week of October 16th in Racine at Wheaton Franciscan, and then it ends with the mock trial. And then for 2018, these are the spring series, and then the fall series is the August and October dates. We have 2 adults in the spring series, 2 adult classes, and then 1 peds and 1 adult in the fall series. I don't know what that's going to look like yet for 2019. We decide, Danielle Long is my colleague and partner in these DOJ SANE classes, and in the program coordination for the DOJ. And based on information that she gets and technical assistance questions that I get, it seems this demand right now is larger for the adult classes than in the pediatric classes. So we wanted to make sure that we were making sure that we were meeting that demand. And right now the demand is more adult and less peds at this point. New for 2018, we in the past, I believe through the end of this year, we had kind of moved the trainings around the state a little bit, and it became a little bit, I don't know what the right word is here, but it's easier, I think, having it in the same places, because the expectations of the course environment, the learning environment, really is at the a priority for us. We want to make sure that, you know, there's technical assistance available, because when we go into these classrooms, I don't always know who to call if something goes wrong. So it's important that, and we have the support from these facilities. So going forward in 2018, there's going to be permanent host sites. In the north, it's going to be St. Clair's and Weston, with Tracy Fremming as the hostess. In the south, it's going to be Wheaton Franciscan in Racine with Rachel Cortez. We have 2 in the east. One is Aurora in Sheboygan with Dina Grundle, and Theta Care in Appleton with Megan. And so and they can host both the adult and the pediatric class. West, I went and did a site visit last week, and I'm just waiting for confirmation before I make that public. But that facility is a brand new classroom. I was up there last week to see it. It seems like we have really good support from the administration, so we just have to make sure that the dates are going to meet with their medical media department, and that we can use that that brand new classroom. It's really state of the art, so I'm really excited about that possibility. DOJ SANE course content. Like I said, if the IFM makes it an educational recommendation, it's a requirement for us. And so our classes for the adult class is 46 hours, and we are able to award continuing education credits for that for the nurses that attend, and that is in collaboration with St. Croix Valley SART. Courtney, who also is faculty DOJ at the DOJ for us, is in charge of maintaining that. She did the application and maintaining everything that we need to make sure we can still award those credits. She awards those, and then so at the end of the lab, the 40 hours is the classroom, the didactic, and 6 hours is the lab. The labs are held in Madison at Unity Point Meritor in West Madison with Kim Curran and Jane Vandermeer, and then we hire some models technical assistant, teaching assistant models that actually come for that pelvic class. And so that's a 6-hour day. And then the 40 hours in the PEDS class. We had looked at moving the lab around like we were doing with the class, but it was difficult for the teaching assistants to travel. So we're keeping that in Madison, and it's going to stay where it is until further notice. It's a clinic. We have a lot of the equipment is donated to us, and the rooms are donated to us. And it's a clinic that's not open on Saturdays, so it's a really good learning environment. The conference room has standard, up-to-the-date equipment for teaching and presenting. So as far as I'm concerned, that's going to remain there for quite some time. The International Association of Forensic Nurses, those guidelines, they put out, I believe it was last year, learning objectives for the classes, and they broke it down by discipline. So when advocates come or law enforcement comes or the prosecution does their presentation, there's certain learning objectives that the IFN has recommended that they meet during those presentations. And the reason for that is because those are actual test items on the board exam. So I make sure that prior to presenting and even putting that presentation together, I went through and divided those learning objectives by discipline, and I make sure that each of those objectives are met with every class, with every presenter. So those are addressed, and I feel confident in going forward that the nurses will have gotten that material in our DOJ SANE class as they prepare to take boards. They can look back on their notes and see that that was a test item, and that was a learning objective that was addressed. Lab, I kind of already mentioned about the clinical skills lab. What we do there is we do an anatomy and physiology review. They get that in the didactic part of the class, but it never hurts to go over that. We do the main anatomy landmarks that they need to look for when they do a pelvic exam and a genital exam. We also do a speculum and pelvic lecture with a demonstration on one of the models. We have one of the models come a little early than the rest of the models, and they do a demonstration on her. Jane does a demonstration on her. And then they actually practice the exam and speculum insertion on the models that come that day, that are assigned to come that day. And then Kim does a phenomenal presentation on photo documentation, and then we end the day with going over 4 case studies that are actually in a book that the IFN has published. Okay, so specific learning objectives. I've kind of already addressed this a little bit as well. They are on the website if anybody ever wants to go and look at those learning objectives. They're divided by the adult class, the pediatrics class, and then there's also an opportunity that if we ever wanted to combine the adult class and the pediatrics class into one class, I don't have any plans to do that at this point because there's so much content to cover. I really don't think that we can do both classes in 64 hours. Our classes right now are at 86, and I can't imagine cutting something away to get down to 64. So at this point, we're going to keep them as is. I already addressed that each presenter is given the objectives, and that these are test items on board certification. Course design. Like I said, the classes were really, in my opinion, in really good shape when I started at DOJ. And what I've done is I've taken both agendas and I've tweaked them a little bit, and I've designed them in ways that they will unfold. They're presented in ways that a case would unfold. Like, we used to have neurobiology of trauma and strangulation presentations in the pediatrics class, and so what I did was I combined the crime lab presentation with the evidence collection of the nurse and the adult, and I freed up some time in the adult class so that I could have the strangulation and the neurobiology of trauma lecture in the adult class. And that has actually worked very well. I think the knowledge retention is better that way, and the course evaluations reflect that it's easier for them to retain and follow with the information that's presented. Like I said, the PEDS course is built on the knowledge of the SANE A course. and a mock trial in an actual courtroom is the only content that is in both courses. And I did that because SANE sustainability, there's two issues that have come into play and that I'm hearing about. And one is testifying in court, and the other is the pelvic clinic. And so when there's a concern with that, with sustainability, I encourage the nurses to team up with an OBGYN women's health nurse practitioner or an MD or a PA that does that day in, or even a health department or a women's clinic that does pelvic exams and speculum exams day in and day out, so that they can at least be exposed to that if they feel that they need a refresher. The mock trial, I'm working with the resource prosecutors to take the design of our mock trial from the class and make it more community friendly, so that the community can get involved and have the nurse get on the stand and practice, so to speak, the direct examination and cross by defense. And so that particular piece, that community mock trial, that's still in development. But the resource prosecutors that I've spoken to are really excited about that potential and that possibility. So that's coming, and like I said, it's still in development. But it will follow the same. It'll follow the same course as the mock trial from what we do in the same class. We actually secure the courtroom many months in advance, and I found that Friday afternoons it's very easy to find an empty courtroom because we have to have the judge's permission to get in there and use that courtroom. And we have someone who's in the role of the judge and defense and the prosecution counsel, and then the other classes, the nurses from the class will sit in the jury box, and then we have a seasoned SANE that will get up there and be the one who's actually on the stand and being examined, so they see what that's like. And that's actually one of the favorites. Even though it's at the end of the week, they really like that it ends with that, and it's a good experience. This is a disclaimer that Ian brought to my attention, I think it was last year sometime. Upon completion of the SANE course or the online course, or any time a nurse takes the SANE course, and after our lab component, the nurses are not ready to go out and see victims independently. There is a process where they get the knowledge, they put into practice in the lab, and then they go back to their programs, and there's an orientation period that their preceptor or their program coordinator has put into place, and they go through not only policies and procedures and the national protocol, the IFM, but also the policies and procedures of their facility, because I can't teach each particular program's policies and procedures. That has to go back on the program, and I think that also is another reason as to why we want to make sure that these nurses that are attending our class have a place to practice, because they want to make, so we're going to give them that knowledge. We want to make sure that they can put that knowledge into practice. And so there is an orientation period, and that lasts several weeks to several months depending on the numbers of victims that come into that facility. It depends on the learning style and the needs of each nurse. Some can be done in a matter of weeks if they feel that they're ready to go. And in the bigger cities like Milwaukee and Madison, that's not going to take as long, nearly as long as somebody in some of those rural areas. So they're not ready to go on their own independently for several weeks to months following completion of the course. In addition to that, there are task mastery skills, and again, this is an IFM recommendation that they be proficient in certain skills within their community, and what does that look like in each community. That's why the preceptor and the program coordinator wants to make sure that, you know, you may not be ready to be off orientation and do this work independently for several months simply because we may not have the number of victims that present, but we want to be able to make sure that when those victims do present to these hospitals and facilities, that they have a SANE nurse ready and willing to help them. SANE exams, as you know, are not a typical urgent care or emergency department encounter. these exams take last many hours on average. So it's very important that the nurse be competent in all aspects of that SANE encounter, and it will be up to her and that program coordinator to determine when they feel ready to function independently and do these exams independently. A lot of times they'll do it with their preceptor or their mentor or their program director several times before actually doing it on their own. They'll kind of be the second set of hands in the room while learning at the same time. We want to make sure that we're turning out quality exams for our victims, and so it is a process. We don't want to rush anybody through it, and if anybody is not comfortable doing that, that's going to be up to the program coordinator to maybe give a little bit more training or a little bit more preceptorship to encourage success in this role. SANE trained versus SANE certification. A SANE trained nurse has completed all of the classroom and educational components, whether it's with DOJ or the online course or elsewhere. And then the ongoing completion of clinical SANE hours. They have to complete a certain amount of hours based on IFM recommendations. And also, what does that look like in their facilities? That could be a different number depending on where they work. And they are able to testify in court. And that was one of the things that went back to making sure that these nurses have experience as a nurse prior to doing these SANE exams. My very first case that I ever did go to court, and they qualified me based on my nursing experience. So even though you may not have been doing this work for quite some time, we can draw on that being you are an expert nurse, you are an experienced nurse prior to doing this subspecialty of nursing. So that's very important, I think, also to understand. When you're certified, you have successfully completed the components of the trained portion of your education, and then also in addition to, you have successfully passed the IFM board examination. The IFM is the body that awards the SANE A and SANE P credentials. So once you have successfully met their eligibility requirements to actually sit for the board examination, and then you've passed the board examination, you may use those credentials as SANE A and or SANE P trained, or SANE certified. There is a relatively new type of certification that is available through IFM. If I'm not mistaken, I believe this came out in 2012 or 2013. It is the Advanced Forensic Nurse Board Certified, and this is not a board examination. This is a certification by portfolio, and that is also on their website through the American Nurses Credentialing Center. You can read all that through there. They have to be an RN, but they also have to hold a graduate degree in either nursing or forensic nursing and have at least a minimum of 2,000 practice hours in forensic nursing within the last 3 years. So that's different than the SANE A and SANE P board eligibility through the IFN. You have to have up to 300 hours in the last 3 years, and to be the advanced forensic nurse, you have to have at least 2,000. Completed 30 minimum continuing education in the specialty area of forensic nursing within the last 3 years. And that could be child abuse, that could be domestic violence, that could be child death, that could be death investigation. There's a lot of other components other than just the sexual assault aspect of forensic nursing. And then fulfill 2 additional professional development categories to be selected from the following list. So you create this portfolio, you have to document all of that information, and then you also submit your CV, and you also submit an exemplar which describes your specialty area of forensic nursing. So it's quite a process, and then it's peer reviewed, and then you're awarded those credentials if you successfully meet their portfolio requirements. SANE certification eligibility, I just want to touch on that for just a little bit. This is the SANE A and the SANE P, not to be confused with the AFNB board certification. Again, it's the minimum 2 years practice experience that you have successfully completed the program, the course program in class and lab for us. and then the PEDS or combined class adult and PEDS that grant 64 hours. So we've added another 6 hours to the adult SANE A course. So instead of just the 40, you're getting 46 from the DOJ. Successful completion of clinical practice hours of at least 300 hours in the previous 3 years prior to applying to sit for the board exam. And it's SANE-related practice. So what do those 300 hours look like? This is the link to become certified for the SANE-trained nurses that want to sit for the board exam. Those 200 to 300 hours are caring for victims. It can be direct care. You can count being on call, teaching, or precepting, consulting, and participating in peer review, which is a process we have here in the DOJ or in Wisconsin with Wisconsin Child Abuse Network. Rita Kadamian organizes the peer review. I want to say it's 4 to 5 times a year, but I know it's the 5th Thursday. Whenever there's 5 Thursdays in a month, it's that last Thursday. So it's a 2-hour process, and these are cases that are sent to her, and then we do the peer review. So you would be able to count those hours towards your eligibility to sit for the board examination. New programs since I started in May of 2015. We have, you can read all those, Monroe, Beloit, Neillsville, Spooner, Superior, and Duluth. I have a star by them because it sounds, if everything goes according to plan, that Superior, St. Mary's and Superior is likely going to start a SANE program November 1st. So I want to put another disclaimer out there that one program could be one nurse, or it could be 24/7 SANE services, including pediatric SANE availability. And then I also want to put this disclaimer out there that we are not always notified if a program dissolves or if a new one begins. Usually I know if a new one is beginning because there's a lot of questions, and sometimes I'll go up there and meet with administration to talk about what that would look like for support. But I'm not always notified if one closes. Since I started in May of 15, we have trained 147 new nurses in SANE A, and we've trained 74. And I added that plus 18 because that's how many we have registered right now for the SANE P class in Racine, so that number could change. But I think those are really great numbers for the state. I want to say that when I started in May, it was 2 adult classes and 2 pediatric classes per year, and we always had a waiting list. And so Danielle and I talked about this, and I went to the administration at DOJ, and we decided that we didn't really want to have anybody on the wait list. We wanted to make sure that if somebody wanted this training, they wouldn't have to wait to get in. So we decided to make 3 of the 4 trainings that DOJ does a year adult trainings, and in doing so, the class sizes are smaller, but we don't have a waiting list, and actually it's a better learning environment because the class size is so small. Or smaller. We average between 18 and 22 with every class. So we're not sitting on top of each other because we've got notebooks, we've got computers, we've got, all the other learning needs that the nurses bring to class with them. So I think that's a really good number, and they're going up. It seems like every class we get, there's at least 1 or 2 more that sign up. So I just want to briefly touch on adults and adolescents. So the SANE classes are divided in SANE, adult and adolescents, and pediatric and adolescents. So SANE P is a pediatric and adolescents. So I'm not going to read this quote to you, but it's on the IFM educational guidelines and recommendations that this is how they're defining how they're splitting those 2 classes and what that means when you have an adolescent that presents for a SANE exam. So adolescents, that the definition that they're using means you're growing into maturity. So it encompasses the psychological, social, and maturational process initiated by the pubertal changes. And we talk about that in the SANE A and the SANE P classes. Developmental age periods, I really don't want to go through this either because it's a pediatric specific knowledge that we also talk about in class, but when it comes to the adolescents, where does pediatrics stop, adolescents start, and adulthood start? And it really is an individualized process with these victims that present. It's not just where are you, how old are you, and where are you in the maturation process. It's a very comprehensive assessment that these nurses do in a fairly short amount of time to determine what evidence they're collecting and where they're falling into treatment plan and care. So this is our website. This is the link to our website. It is a constant work in progress. Like I said, I'm not always notified of program changes. When I started at the DOJ, we had a map it was a map of Wisconsin, and then there were like little drop pins of where SANE services were currently available. And I thought that was really confusing. So I'm in development with another department at the DOJ, and what I'm planning to do is I've taken this map, and what we're going to do is you're going to have the ability to click on a county, and when you do so, I want to go back to that. You're going to be able to see where you can go for SANE victim services, where you can go to get a SANE exam. Is that program open 24/7? Do they have pediatric coverage? And if the answer is no to 24/7, there will be something listed that will say where you can go. And if they don't have pediatric coverage, it'll say where you can go for pediatric SANE. I don't know how much room I'm going to have available, so I'm hoping that the address and a phone number will come up as well. But like I said, that is still a work in progress, and we're getting there. We're getting there. I was working with somebody last week late at night, and we were still tweaking this process. So hopefully it'll be up and running in the next few months. Okay. SANE technical assistance. Most of the calls that I get regarding SANE services throughout the state are regarding classes and eligibility to take the classes. I get a lot of questions regarding SANE certification. Program development resource, I talked to you a little bit about that. I really enjoy going out and looking to see where these new programs want to start, because they make it their own, but we're very fortunate that the SANEs in this state are a very cohesive group, and they're very helpful. We call it the sister and brotherhood of SANE. So no one really has ownership over any of the documents or documentation or policies and procedures are actively shared amongst the programs, especially when new ones are starting. But I also encourage them to get legal involved, because every hospital facility has their own legal department, and they like to have things done a certain way. So I encourage that. But I always enjoy those trips. And then the IFM guidelines. I get several questions on just guidelines in general and what the IFM recommends. Future SANE. I work very closely with the IFM and the Rural Wisconsin Health Coalition. They are very good at, I know that Megan and at Theta Care is holding a PEDS refresher course. I've talked to you a little bit about the pelvic exam clinics and the regional mock trial. We're looking at having 24/7 SANE TA availability. Dina Grundle is the current president of the local chapter of IFM, and she brought that to the attention of the DOJ, and I believe is still gathering information on that. So that's something that is very possible down the road. So we'll see where that takes us. And like I said, it's a collaborative effort. Nobody owns anything with this work in Wisconsin. I think it's very neat to see how the numbers are working together, and the SANEs are very cohesive, very, very helpful to new programs and new SANEs. Safe Fund reminders. Be sure that you fax the cover sheet after completion of an exam. It is at the request of the billing department, usually, that to write on their bill insurance, or do not bill insurance, make that very clear on there. But it's also up to the victim whether or not they want insurance billed, So be sure that that's very clear on the fax. cover sheet that goes to the billing department in each one of the programs. Safe Fund will pay whether or not a victim chooses to report or is undecided. It does not pay for the Plan B, although Crime Victim Comp does, as long as they report to law enforcement. And then please be sure that the exam meets the IFM protocol. What I mean by that is sometimes a victim will present and they want to just make sure they're okay, but they don't want to have, a complete forensic exam done. They just want maybe a blood pressure check, just a once-over, but nothing, no treatment, no anything that falls into the IFM protocol. So if there's nothing that falls into the IFM protocol, State Fund is not going to pay for that. Karen Moore, who was our administrator, retired as of September 1st, and Courtney Gordon is now in that role. And I worked very closely with Karen, and Courtney has not been afraid to come to me and ask questions about the protocol. So we go through that as Courtney needs to. Can medications be given to minors when a parent or guardian is not present? You know what, I'm going to have to refer that back to each program and policy because I don't want to just give that a blanket statement, because each program has its own protocol, so know what that is in your protocol at your facility. Crime Victim Comp reminders, it is the payer of last resort. Victim must report to law enforcement in order for Crime Victim Comp to pay. It will pay for the Plan B, and it pays for medical expenses not covered by insurance. And Kathy Zupan is the coordinator of the Crime Victim Compensation.
Okay, if people have questions, we're going to keep the line open here. We also have some other WCASA staff here that also have some questions. So maybe we'll start with those while you all are typing in your questions.
Yeah, so hi everyone, this is Leslie over at WCASA, and we do have some questions that we've heard from you all as we've gone out to visit and through SAR teams and staff. So we've kind of got a little list here. So one of the questions that we've heard from a couple of different places, Lori, you spoke about the map and how you can see if there's not a SANE program near you, where's the closest one. Are there other options for victims in counties where there isn't a SANE program? Is the best thing to travel, or is there other things that advocates can look for?
I would definitely look for a SANE program. No disrespect to emergency rooms, but this is a specialty. There's obviously a lot of training that goes into this. These are not 20-minute encounters, and so in my opinion, in order to get the best treatment and care and making sure that we follow protocol, especially if they're going to report to law enforcement, number one, that everything is done correctly and by the protocol, and number two, if they haven't decided to report, they can still get that evidence collected, and they have 9.5 years to change their mind. So I would always search for a SANE program, and yes, sometimes that means they'll have to travel. Repost number for Courtney. There it is. The question is, can SANE nurses give out medication to minors without parent consent, and how does a SANE exam work without a parent present? Again, that's going back to your facility's protocol and policy.
So one of the other questions we've heard is also this, I don't know if everyone knows, but this new partnership you all have with the regional prosecutors in the mock trials. So if you could just talk a little bit more about their involvement and how that's been going.
We're still in the discussion phase, and I think what it's going to do is model the ones that we do in the classes so that they're the same and the content is the same and the experience is the same. So like I said, it's still in the discussion phases, but it will probably be in each of the 4 regions. You know, Region 1 is Milwaukee and Waukesha. There's 2 regional prosecutors, so it'll probably be somewhere in the middle of that region. And then Crystal's up in Region 3, and Melissa is in 4, and I think we're still recruiting for Dane.
I guess the only other one we've had that we've heard a couple of communities asking, so for the ones that don't, again, going back to the ones that don't have a SANE program, you know, for those who, as part of their start, they're like, how can we set up a SANE program? do they need to partner with hospitals in the communities? How can they go about getting one off the ground if maybe hospitals, well, number one, does it have to be hospitals? And number two, if the hospitals aren't interested, what can they do to really get a SANE program in their county?
Best practice says it's hospital. But my role is not to tell them where to build them. What does that look like for the community, and what community partners do you have that are willing to support that? Meaning, will you have the SART team? There's a financial component to that. Where's the liability for the nurses? Where's documentation going to be stored? Where are the supplies going to be stored? You know, those are things you have to think about when you're starting these programs. I'm not saying it can't be done outside of a hospital, because it can. But there's a little bit more specialty specifics that would need to be designed in order to meet those needs outside the hospital.
So those were the big ones that we had just heard around from the different meetings we've been at. I don't know if you have more.
Okay, so the question is, if a victim shows up at the emergency room of a hospital that doesn't have a SANE program, and they do vitals and check the victim out before transferring them to another hospital with SANE program, who covers that first bill? Technically, that's going to be a write-off of that first emergency room, because there's been no forensic protocol items that were met. So if they're stable enough to transfer, and all you did was check out the victims and did a look-see with vitals and just a quick assessment, but there was no forensic component of that, usually the first hospital will write that bill off. The SAFE fund was used for the SANE exam, but victims insurance billed for the initial hospital even though they couldn't meet the SANE needs. That would be an internal discussion to have with your billing department and admin.
I actually had a question that came up during your presentation, and maybe this was already covered, but I was just curious. So SANE trained versus SANE certified, are there reasons why a SANE nurse would want to go to the certified level other than, because if they can testify, they can do all the things, what are the benefits of them going to certified versus SANE?
It's easier to qualify them as an expert if you have a board certification.
So they can testify as SANE trained, but they'd be an expert witness.
And that would be open to the prosecution too. How do they qualify them on the stand? That doesn't mean that they're not good at what they do. They may not have met the eligibility requirements. Some nurses have test anxiety. You know, it happens. My understanding is if there's a board certification, you've already met the criteria to make you an expert. So it's easier to qualify you, but there's ways to get around that if you don't have that certification.
Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, and it appears that there are not at this point, if I talk slowly.
You know what, I'm going to put my contact information up there. So some of you may or may not know, in my role, I'm there 3 days a week. Typically, those are my hours, and that goes directly to my desk, that phone number. But like I said, I'm out a lot of times either doing trainings, or I've got the SANE programs classes that I'm running, or I'm visiting SANE programs. So if I'm not there, please leave me a message and I will get back to you, or even email me. I think I don't have my email on there. My email is, you're going to put it on there. It's thompsonll@doj.state.wi.us. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you want to shoot my way or call me with. I'm happy to do that.
Okay, well, that will conclude our webinar today. Again, a big thank you to Lori for coming in today and presenting this webinar. I know that I learn something every time I hear Lori talk about development of SANE programs and SANE training, and that piece that she mentioned about just because someone goes to the class doesn't mean they're already ready. It was news to me, so I'm hoping that this information helps folks around the state understand the processes that SANE nurses go through to be trained. And again, just big thank you to Lori. And that concludes our medical webinar series for 2017. Again, this will be archived for folks if they want to look back at that in later times. And thank you again.